Hello, and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to talk about this idea of municipal handgun bans. And if you're not familiar with this issue, Trudeau has promised to allow municipalities to criminally ban handguns within their jurisdictions. This is going to be a big issue. Let's discuss this proposal on a few grounds. The first one is actually a constitutional issue. And I'll admit, I'm not a constitutional law scholar here, so I could be wrong about some of this, but I'm looking into it, and I see some big problems. Let's go to the first thing. And before I switch over to the legislation, the Constitution, most people think of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms when they think of the Constitution, and those rights that are guaranteed to us. However, the Constitution is actually much larger than that. A constitution sets out that we have a government and how it works. So how it's structured, how the internal mechanisms function, all of this stuff. It's a fascinating but very complicated document. But one sort of set of sections that's seen a fair bit of court battles is the sections on division of powers. And what these sections do is they divide up certain areas of government influence between the federal government and the provincial government. These end up being called certain heads of power. What this means is that the federal government is given certain powers, and the provincial governments have different powers. These are set up in sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution. I'm not going to read them out to you, but I will sort of highlight some things. When we look at the powers of the federal government, there are things that tend to be sort of broad across the country. So we've got the Postal Service, we've got the Census and Statistics, militia, military and naval service, and defense. This makes sense. You want your military to be the Canadian military and not, the military of Alberta and the military of Saskatchewan and so forth. Currency and coinage. Again, makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't want to be in a country where it's, the British Columbia dollar is worth, however many Alberta dinars, which is worth, however many, Quebecois, whatever they decide to call it. That would just be a nightmare. So that's why, currency is given to the federal government so that we can have one consistent, Canadian dollar. But one of the other ones that's important here is number 27, the criminal law, which they note as accept the Constitution of Courts of Criminal Jurisdiction, but including the procedure in criminal matters. The firearms reference had the Supreme Court determine that, yes, the federal government can regulate firearms within the criminal law power. That's how the federal government regulates firearms, is through this mechanism. But we can also see some things are exclusive powers of provincial legislatures. And these are typically sort of more local things. In particular, generally all matters of a merely local or private nature in the province. So again, the provinces sort of run stuff that happens within the provinces. The federal government deals with more large-scale things. There's a rule also that applies in Canadian federalism, which is a rule about delegation of powers, which basically says that these different groups, the federal government and the provincial government, can't easily give their powers away to each other. So if, for instance, the federal government, who handles copyright, if they decided that they don't want to do that anymore, and instead they just want to give the power to the province, and each province will now have to set up their own copyright rules, and they'll have that power, that would be unconstitutional. The federal government has that power. They can't give it to the provinces. Now, municipalities are a creature of provincial power. What that means is that they're under the provincial powers, and so it seems very strange that the federal government would be saying, we want to take this criminal law power and give it to municipalities, which again are a provincial sort of entity. I couldn't find anything really parallel to this. It seems to me that this is going to be a real big problem because there's, a delegation issue there. And you're going to get gun owners saying, wait a minute, you can't give away this power. And so all of these purported municipal bans are invalid. And that's going to be one, big issue. And ultimately, I think that's going to end up at the Supreme Court because it's such a huge issue in that sense. But there's another one. And that is that the proposal for this ban for this rule is not only that municipalities would be able to ban handguns, but Trudeau has said that this would be something that applies even if the province disagrees. They want to give this power to the municipalities directly and skip over provincial influence. That's a problem because in a constitutional sense, municipalities are solely creatures of provincial power. They don't have any powers that aren't specifically given to them by the province. And so this notion of now the federal government giving to a municipality a power that is superior to that of the province is going to be a major fight because provincial governments do not like having their power usurped in this fashion. One in particular that is particularly sort of ornery about this notion is Quebec. And so we may see the Bloc Québécois, for instance, deciding that their dislike of firearms is overwhelmed by their even greater dislike of the provincial government, or of the federal government rather, telling the province what they can and can't do. So, and they're not just going to be thinking about this gun restriction. That's not going to be the only thing on their mind. The other thing that's going to be on their mind is, if we say that we're okay with this, what do they do next? Because if the federal government is going to start taking powers away from the province and giving them to municipalities, or, giving municipalities power over the provinces, they're not going to want to open that door. So I think that's going to be a huge fight, and one that, again, will have to end up in front of the Supreme Court, because how could it not? It's just such a big, thorny issue. Now, maybe I've missed something. If you are, a viewer and you're a constitutional law sort of guru, and you think you've got a solution to this, get in touch with me, because I've asked several people who I greatly respect on constitutional law issues, and I haven't seen anybody who said that they could give me an answer to this one. The next thing I want to discuss is whether or not this is a good idea. Now, we're not going to be able to look at any proposed legislation because we don't have any yet. So I can't get into the language of the law here and start dissecting it. But we can look at the general sort of concept, the general idea here. And to do that, I'm going to pull up Edmonton. That's where I'm living right now. This is via Google Earth. You can see the attribution in the bottom corner. Now, Edmonton is a fairly large, sprawling sort of city with a number of smaller communities here around the outskirts. So if we look at this, and as with everywhere, you've got a whole bunch of little towns in various places. Now, let's say you shoot at Phoenix, which is over here in Sherwood Park to the east of Edmonton. But let's say you live over here in Spruce Grove or in Atchison. And let's say that Edmonton decides to implement a handgun ban. Well, now you've got a bit of a problem, because if you want to go from Spruce Grove to Sherwood Park without crossing through Edmonton, you're going to either have to go sort of north up through Callahoo and then Namao and then Fort Saskatchewan and then down to Sherwood Park and hope that none of those places implement their own, municipal ban. Or, south, and again, hoping that none of the other communities that you might cross through implement, a restriction of their own. If we go and sort of head over to Vancouver, Vancouver's got, a similar issue with little sort of sub-communities that each may have their own rules. It can become a very difficult navigational hazard. Now, it becomes even worse if you start talking about places, natural, geographic, or, other sort of constrictions. Let's say that you live on Vancouver Island and you want to bring your handguns for whatever reason, and there's all sorts of reasons why you might want to do so. You want to go to Kamloops. Well, there's only so many ferry crossings from Vancouver Island to get to Kamloops. And what do you do if those places have implemented their own restrictions? What about, I used to have a range membership way up here in Fort McMurray. And there's not a lot of roads that connect Fort McMurray through Edmonton. And if in some of these places, if one of these small towns decides they want to put in a ban, it becomes a real big problem. I actually used to, go up to Fort McMurray for court fairly often. And so I had an authorization to transport that allowed me to drive up to Fort McMurray, do my court business, hit the range, once I was done, and then drive back. It was a good system. But how do you do that if there's a blockage along the way? You also end up with problems for remote areas. And in particular, I'm thinking of remote Aboriginal communities, reserves. Some of these reserves may actually border onto nearby towns, such that from the reserve, you don't have a whole lot of, you might connect to one town or maybe two towns, and there's no way to go around them. If you're in one of those situations, you're going to be in a situation where your town, your community, allows you to possess handguns, but there's no way to actually take them anywhere to use them because you're connected there. And this is going to be a real interesting problem if you have the Aboriginal community on a reserve being told that they can't take their guns to the range by a non-Aboriginal community that's neighboring them, but happens to block off their access to, major thoroughfares. So not only are we going to see just practicality aspects, but this may start triggering equal protection and rights issues in that sense. If you think about somebody going from Edmonton to Vancouver, I've made this drive with handguns. But now in order to do that, you'd have to look up every small town that you might stop in. And especially the small towns that you might stop in, say, the Rockies, because there just aren't that many places to cross the Rockies. It's a big, I don't care if you've got four-wheel drive, you're not going up the Rockies through anything other than a road. Unless you're happen to be operating a helicopter. If you're having to look up every small town that you might be passing through and what their bylaws are, because if you get that wrong, you could go to jail. Keep in mind, ignorance of the law is no excuse. You're not going to get a pass just because you happen to cross through, the town of Horsefly that we see here. And I apologize to the residents of Horsefly, but it's an entertaining name. It just leapt out at me. If you don't happen to look up what their bylaws are, that's going to be a problem. It seems that this is a completely unworkable system, and it goes completely against the fundamental idea that was had in the drafting of the Constitution of Canada, because what we see here is they gave the criminal law power to the federal government because that way you get consistent laws across Canada. If something's a crime in British Columbia, it's going to be a crime in Alberta, it's going to be a crime in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and so on and so on. Similarly, if it's legal in one of these places, at least in terms of the criminal law power, it's going to be legal in all of them. This allows for some great consistency. You know what the law is across Canada in terms of the criminal law sphere. Breaking that down is a really bad idea and could have really bad consequences in terms of people who are doing their best to abide by the law, doing their best to follow the rules, but just can't possibly keep up with this. How is somebody going to be expected to look up, 5 or 6 different municipalities' bylaws when they're looking at, how to take their gun from one place to another? It's a major problem. I don't see how this is something that could be easily resolved. The other thing to look at is that the impact of this is going to be huge when you start talking about the people who live in these communities. Whenever you start talking about a hobby or a sport or anything like that, the people who practice that hobby, sport, whatever, are going to be outnumbered by the people who don't. There's more people who play or who don't play football in Edmonton than who do. And similarly for soccer, for chess, for knitting, for anything you could, think of here. But so the people who aren't going to be affected aren't really going to care one way or another. But if you're an Olympic target shooter and you happen to live in Toronto and Toronto says, well, we're banning handguns here, having to pack up and move or else give up your Olympic dreams is a real big, that's thorny. That's a problem. This just seems like a really bad idea for a number of reasons, and I don't know why they're looking to implement this. It's one of these ideas that sounds good politically, but maybe doesn't end up being such a good idea when you start getting into the actual implementation questions of it. I wonder how much of this they thought out. I also wonder how much they think this is going to have an impact on crime, because of course criminals who are, and this is where we're talking about the vast majority of violence, is people who don't have a license, and they don't care about getting a license because they know that, that's the cost they pay to play the game there. So they're, adding on another charge. Well, if they're already looking at charges for, having a firearm without a license, and having a firearm with ammunition without a license, and having a restricted firearm without having an authorization to transport, and all of these things, adding one more charge to the box isn't going to really change their mind. The other notion of, well, maybe they won't be able to get them because they won't be able to steal them. Well, they're still going to be able to steal firearms. That's not a major source of where these come from, but it is a potential source, and they're still going to be able to move them around. They're going to be able to smuggle them. They're going to be able to make them themselves. It's the criminal possession of handguns is really a market that's more driven by the demand. People are willing to pay for these because they're, drug dealers and they have money, and they're willing to, to go to whatever lengths it is to carry handguns. We're not going to be able to stop them through this. They're going to find ways to get around this, because if they can move heroin into the country, they can move guns into the country. All we're doing is just we're waving a flag to say we really care about this issue, but it's not going to accomplish anything. And at the end of the day, it is going to harm some actual people. So I don't think this is a good idea. I think that there's a whole lot of implementational problems that they just haven't thought of here, and constitutional problems that I don't know how they're going to get around. I think this is a real big issue, and yeah, I guess those are my thoughts on that. It's not an easy one. I wish I had better answers for for people who might be affected by this if it gets implemented, especially residents of Toronto. I feel for you if this gets put in place. I want to thank you for watching. If you found this educational or interesting, please like, share, and subscribe. The channel is growing. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to keep up on comments as best I can. If there's something you want me to, cover, something about this issue that you don't feel I addressed, if you think I got something wrong, please leave it in the comments below. I am trying to get to all of them, although I will admit I'm a little overwhelmed by the response. I'm kind of surprised, but thank you again. I also want to thank my $10 Patreon supporters: Ma Buddy Keith, Process Eng, Stephen Larson, General Counsel to the CCFR, John Robinson, Tim Rogers, Roy Haddock, Fracklesdack, Jean-Alexandre Tessier, Cameron Johnson, Sir Goat, Sights and Arms Limited, Chaba Hollow, Peter Heinum, Craig Kwan, Akin Coxall, and North Central Process Service. Thank you, and if you want your name on that list, I've got a link to my Patreon below. I hope I've armed you with some knowledge, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.